It's a small building on a small patch of land in a small Northern California town. Yet over the last 150 years, it's played an enormous role in shaping the history of the San Francisco Peninsula. It's a place where early settlers could wave down a roaring steam train and hop aboard. A place where crops and building materials were loaded up to supply San Francisco after the California Gold Rush. The Atherton train station has not only helped establish the town of Atherton, it's helped connect the surrounding cities and suburbs. And it's helped create daily commutes that have transformed what was once remote countryside into the vibrant mecca of industry that the Southern Peninsula is today. The discovery of gold in Northern California sparked an era of explosive growth and newfound wealth in the city of San Francisco. People from all over the world came to cash in on the Great Gold Rush, creating a huge demand for supplies of all kinds, especially the crops that were growing in the rich farmlands 50 miles south of the city.
They came to California to get the gold, and thousands of people came from all around the world. And they got here, and they needed to exchange goods and services.
Most people came into the Southern Peninsula by boat, getting off in Redwood City and getting a stagecoach or a wagon. But the roads were very, very poor.
In 1860, the counties of San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara joined forces to finance the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad Company.
The San Francisco to San Jose Railroad was largely built by Chinese laborers, which I don't believe were used on any other railroad before that, and obviously became very important in railroad construction with the Transcontinental Railroad.
They built it fairly quickly, over 60 miles long. That all had to be built by hand. They built the cross ties. They had to cut the trees down first and bring in the iron from the east by ship.
After 3 years of construction, an inaugural train left San Francisco on October 17, 1863. That day, the train traveled to Mayfield Station, which is now the California Avenue stop in Palo Alto. Just a few months later, the first train traveled to the end of the line in San Jose. When it pulled into the station, the Woodburner was greeted by cheering crowds, bands, and a 36-gun salute. In 1870, the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad was consolidated with the Southern Pacific Railroad. At the time, Atherton was a very sparsely populated area known as Fair Oaks. The first known listing of Fair Oaks on the train schedule was in 1866. For the first 50 years of the railroad, Fair Oaks functioned as a flag stop. Although there was no station, people could board the train there by literally flagging it down.
The Fair Oaks flag stop was important because as properties were developed down here, there was large farm production, and residents from San Francisco wanted to get out of the fog and get into the warmer environment in the Southern Peninsula. The Fair Oaks flag stop enabled them to do that. Around the Fair Oaks flag stop, it was very rural, essentially farm country. So instead of having to transport all of the produce and building materials, the train would stop at Fair Oaks when the wagons were ready to unload.
In 1886, 20 years after train service began, Southern Pacific built the first train shelter at the Fair Oaks flag stop. It was a 16 by 20-foot open-sided structure with 6 wooden posts and a double-sided bench. On April 18, 1906, Northern California was rocked by a devastating earthquake. With an estimated 7.9 magnitude, the deadly quake sparked a fire that destroyed 80% of the buildings in San Francisco. More than 3,000 people lost their lives, and many more were left homeless. Martial law was declared, and the railroad became an essential part of an enormous evacuation effort. Trains and ferries operated free of charge, helping an estimated 224,000 people flee the city. Many residents who had summer homes on the peninsula moved their families there. Others moved to new homes that were starting to be built in the area.
In 1912, Southern Pacific asked the residents to identify a different name than Fair Oaks because there was a train station in Sacramento County called Fair Oaks. The residents got together at the home of Perry Ayers, and they decided to change the name to Atherton in honor of Faxon Atherton, who had built the first very substantial house in 1862.
The train station saw various architectural changes over the years. In 1913, Southern Pacific agreed to convert the newly named Atherton train stop into a permanent wood-frame structure. It featured 8 concrete columns and a Spanish-style terracotta roof. It also displayed the very first Atherton sign. 3 years later, the train stop was modified again with the unique addition of 3 sides of glass.
A passenger shelter shed typically would have no glass because glass breaks. There are very few ordinary wooden shelter sheds that had even a glass window, but one built totally of glass. I know of no other example in the world.
In the 1930s, trains became a popular and glamorous way to travel. Southern Pacific's Coast Daylight was an especially luxurious ride, providing daily service between San Francisco and Los Angeles, which took about 9.5 hours. Billed as the most beautiful passenger train in the world, it featured coastal views, chairs that swiveled and reclined, bars, dining cars, and air conditioning. Passengers dressed up for the occasion, paying $14 for a round-trip fare. Then in 1939, World War II began. Trains became a lifeline, extending service to deliver troops and vital supplies to local military bases. After the war, many veterans moved to the peninsula and became part of a growing wave of daily commuters.
Between 1940 and 1960, a very large number of estates were divided up. Many more people moved into the area. Most of those people worked in San Francisco. And when you look at images of that period, you see the parking lot is completely full of cars. Large numbers of people commuted on the train to San Francisco.
The increase in ridership spurred more modifications to the train station. In 1945, it was fully enclosed in glass, with a glass door and an internal newspaper stand. In 1954, the structure had a more substantial remodel and expansion. New 15-foot long wings were added on each side, which featured 4 new concrete columns and additional glass walls. During this period, there were significant advancements in train engine technology. Steam trains, which had been in service for decades, began to be phased out in favor of diesel locomotives. By the end of the 1950s, the Peninsula train was officially a commuter train, powered entirely by diesel.
Steam was so prevalent for 100 years. The reason the railroads went from steam to diesel in the 50s is that there was better acceleration, they could standardize parts, and it just overwhelmingly affected the bottom line. It was cleaner, it was more efficient, that's why they went to diesel.
By 1950, the grand commuter era for the train had arrived, a golden period of railroad travel that would last 30 years. While some residents boarded the morning train to shop in San Francisco, most of the riders were businessmen. Dressed in suits with briefcases in hand, they filled the coach cars, smoking, reading newspapers, and playing cards on their way to work.
People from Atherton liked to ride the train because it was easy. You'd leave your car at the train station and you could get to downtown San Francisco in probably 45 minutes. I personally took it for 22 years. It was very pleasant. There were parties going on the train, usually on Friday.
As the Peninsula freeways were developed over the next few decades, they began to create serious competition for the railway. During the 1970s, many people started to drive instead of taking the train. By the 1980s, cars had become the most popular way to get to work.
Beginning in about 1980, the business climate really shifted from being centered in San Francisco to being centered in the Silicon Valley. And people started to commute much more down to the south. The Atherton train station was still used, but it was used much less.
With the number of railway commuters decreasing, responsibility for the Peninsula commuter service was shifted away from Southern Pacific, first to the state of California and eventually to Caltrain. In 1998, Caltrain announced plans to electrify its service and phase out the use of diesel engines, and it's anticipated that the project will be operational by 2024 or 2025. Over the years, the train through Atherton has evolved from steam power to diesel to electrification, and may evolve even further with new technologies on the horizon. In the meantime, these changes have had an impact on the Atherton station.
Also in 1998, because of reduced ridership, Caltrain announced that it was going to close the Atherton station. There was a huge response from Atherton residents, a number of whom had settled in Atherton to be close to the train. In response to the protest, Caltrain decided that it would keep the station open, but to eliminate weekday service and to provide only weekend service. The train is very noisy when it blasts its horn, which it's obligated to do in every road crossing to stop the train blowing its horn. You have to make each of those railroad crossings safe. In 2015, we actually announced that we were establishing a quiet zone. Once the horn wasn't blowing anymore, Atherton residents couldn't believe how peaceful their lives became.
The Atherton train station was formally closed by Caltrain in 2020. To honor its service, the town of Atherton decided to preserve the structure and convert it into a small train museum.
The train station has been a really important part of Atherton's community. For 50 years, it was a flag stop called the Fair Oaks Flag Stop. For the last 100 years, it's been a station, the Atherton train station. It's a loved, old station. It's absolutely a part of Atherton.
From the start, the development and transformation of the peninsula was driven by the railroad. It was essential to settling the remote countryside. It's the reason many Chinese workers and their families immigrated to the area. It was a workhorse during wartime. It helped create a daily commute and even brought a little glamour to it. It became a link for residents, first to the thriving businesses of San Francisco, and then to the explosive innovation of Silicon Valley. All along the way, the train has been a reflection of changing times and generations, creating connections, powering growth, and moving people between work and home. And the Atherton train station stands proudly today as part of that legacy.